All right, let's kick off the official video one of One American's Perspective. So I think it's important to really highlight and dive into one topic area prior to getting into others, because I think it has the facets of this one thing uh, really really involve themselves and help shape our understanding and our opinions on how many other on many other topics. And that one thing is suffering. So suffering being the the undergoing of pain or discomfort, whether physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual, and how to deal with that. It is my opinion that suffering is a universal human trait. So take me for example. I am 30-something white American male living in the 21st century. By most objective standards, I've had more privilege, to use a word that's in the common vernacular nowadays. I've had more privilege than perhaps anyone else in human history. I mean, we have the advent of technology and healthcare. I live in a relatively safe country where I don't have to worry about my family being hunted down. Hopefully not yet, anyway. Have ample money to buy luxury goods, running water, food, a warm place to lay my head at night. All of these things are even today around the world, people are just hoping and clawing and wishing and praying and thinking that those things are out of their reach. All those things aside, I've experienced suffering. And this is not a relative whose suffering is more or less, but purely to state that if somebody who has enjoyed much more than most people throughout human history have, or at least that's my speculation, can endure some level of suffering, then it would stand to reason that everyone at some point in time will have suffering. So I think it's important to highlight that. One reference that I would throw out to you guys is a book by the author Viktor Frankl. Man's Search for Meaning is the name of the book. He was a psychologist and a Holocaust survivor who talked about how he endured the horrors of the concentration camps, perhaps some of the most horrific environments that a human being could experience, and how he was able to embrace his suffering to find a deeper meaning. So I would recommend to anybody who wants to know more about this subject, in my mind, probably the pinnacle writer of Man's Search for Meaning. In fact, if you look up Milk and Bourbon podcast, myself and a friend of mine, Nick, did a podcast on this book. I'll link to it in the show notes. So, if suffering is a universal human truth, something that, if you accept the premise, is inevitable, how do we move forward from there? Well, I'd posit to you that you have, relatively speaking, two camps, and you can have people sliding on the spectrum of those two camps, depending on the situation and their experience, their frame of reference at that time. And you can have a camp that says, well, it should be our goal to eliminate suffering because it's unnecessary, it's painful, in fact, it can be deadly to some extent in some places. And then those that would say, well, suffering is an inevitability, how do we make the most of it? And I think there are times and places where you do want to eliminate suffering. If people are living in raw sewage, that's causing disease and death, that's probably something that if we have the power to eliminate, that we'd want to eliminate. So there's a time to do that. When it comes to some other things, maybe an existential crisis, you're suffering because you don't have a purpose in your life. Well, that's something that because of the psychological nature, that you might not be able to ever step out of until you embrace that suffering and then find a reason to overcome it. And I would even highlight that in the former example, rather, if you had a purpose and a meaning, and really that's the thesis behind Frankel's book, is that if you have a sufficient meaning behind why you're doing what you're doing, you can endure an unlimited amount of suffering. In fact, I'll have to think about it. I can't remember, the philosopher said, he who has a reason why can withstand any how or what. I'm butchering that, but essentially having a deep and purposeful why. And I mean, you have writers like Simon Sinek talk about that in a leadership perspective, and there's different modern writers and ancient philosophers that have circled the drain on the same subject, as having a truly meaningful purpose as the antidote to the inevitable suffering that we will have. So when we talk about things like abortion, talk about things like gun control, things like war, healthcare, social unrest, racism, whatever topics that are going to come up in this, I think it's important to frame that suffering underlies a lot of the friction caused in those topics, and that as we're parsing out what maybe is the right thing to do, what is the actual truth of the situation, we need to understand that suffering is inevitably a part of it. What suffering falls on the left side of the spectrum, where we say, oh, this is unnecessary suffering, we could do something to eliminate it, or on the right side of the spectrum, where this is an inevitable level of suffering, and in fact, if we embrace it, we can use it to turn it for good. And I'll give you the example of maybe an Olympic athlete. The amount of training and time and physical and mental suffering and sacrifice that they go through to get to the next level, and then hopefully eventually become the best in the world in whatever their given practices. Suffering is an inevitable part of that process. However, on the back side of it, and even throughout the journey of it, they pick up lessons and meaning within that in order to embrace that, and it ends up being a change for good. So if you have any examples of positive or negative suffering, that might be a good time to leave them in the comments and bring up discussions, and we'll move forward from there. But suffering, video number 2. Have a good day.